Welcome to AFOA Canada's third webinar in the series themed Resiliency in Challenging Times. We are sharing resources and information that can help you navigate through the ever-changing events during this unprecedented time. If you have any questions during the presentation, please add them to the Q&A or chat window. There will be a 15 to 20-minute Q&A at the end of the presentation as well. There will also be polling questions throughout the webinar, so please submit your answers. Please visit our website for more information and to view the recordings of slides that will be added to the webinar page after this session. Today, our presentation is themed The Resiliency of Indigenous Economies in Action. With tens of millions of dollars being settled on First Nation communities, it's our time to stand up and take our rightful place in Canada's economy. Not all of us grew up with warm clothes, running water, proper schooling. Now is our chance to move forward as an educated force to not only change our personal future, but to reconcile our pasts. This webinar will speak about how the first people have always been resilient during changing environments. The webinar will be presented by Georgina Villeneuve, Vice President of Trust Services at Peace Trust, and Scott Robertson, a certified specialist in Indigenous legal issues and associate at Nabagabo Corbier. Welcome to AFOA Canada's second webinar series. Over to you, Jeff Brikatich. Jeff.
Thanks, Terry, and good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure today to introduce and read the bios of the two presenters we have, starting with Georgina Villeneuve, VP Trust Services at Peace Trust. Georgina brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in the administration and settlement of First Nation trusts. Georgina has over 22 years of experience in the trust industry and has been administering First Nation trusts for over 19 years. She's a member of the Wesley First Nation. Georgina earned an undergrad degree in commerce from the University of Calgary and an MBA from the University of Regina. She obtained her MTI, Member in Trust Institute, designation through the Institute of Canadian Bankers. Georgina has been a past member, I should say, of the Regina Estate Council, a former consultant for the Agricultural Institute of Management in Saskatchewan, and is currently a member of the Estate Planning Council of Edmonton, STEP, NATOA, CANDU, and AFOA. Mr. Scott Robertson is a member of the Six Nations of Grand River and associate in the law firm of Nabagabo Corbier, practicing exclusively in matters related to Indigenous peoples. Scott is certified by the Law Society of Upper Canada as a specialist in Indigenous legal issues, litigation, and advocacy. Scott was originally elected to the board of the Indigenous Bar Association in 2014 and served as the president from 2017 to 2019. In addition, Scott currently serves as a member of the Federal Court's Aboriginal Law Bar Liaison Committee, as well as the Action Committee on the Access to Justice in Civil and Family Matters. Working directly with First Nation communities, businesses, and organizations, Scott has developed considerable insight into the growing economic needs of First Nations. Scott is regularly called upon to assist First Nations in negotiations with private and public interest groups to develop innovative economic growth strategies which incorporate First Nation traditional knowledge. In addition to his solicitor experience, Scott is also a skilled advocate and litigator who has represented First Nation clients at all levels of courts and tribunals. Scott has dedicated his practice to improving the quality of health and prosperity for First Nation communities while preserving the unique identity of Canada's original inhabitants. Let me say that both Scott and Georgina, besides having tremendous practical experience, are also very, very well educated with multiple degrees for both of them. I'm going to let them just give an introduction now and just talk about themselves for a bit and the topic, and then I'm going to ask some questions. So I think we'll start with you first, Georgina, if we may.
Thank you, Jeff. Before I get into my opening comments, I need to issue a retraction. And I just want to state, in the marketing of this event, I missed crediting Carol Anne Hilton's article in the Corporate Knight. I apologize to Ms. Hilton and encourage anyone who has not read her article or visited her website to do so. Her message and call to action is really important, and for myself personally, it has been very motivating. So to go on to my opening comments, there's been a lot of talk about resilience. And in the workplace, there's a lot of sessions with staff and management on how to help your employees deal with change. And recently, I received an email from one of my colleagues, and they were talking about there's going to be someone coming in and taking photos in my office, and if I would be so kind, if I could go in and take those photos down, and I thought, well, why? Because these people have long gone, and they're just people that mean something to me. But I went in and I took them down, and then it started making me think about a resilience and how we have to change. And most of all, it got me thinking about back home in Morley. And, you know, growing up, we didn't have the running water. And you do not know what kind of luxury it is to have running water. We didn't have, you know, proper clothes, and sometimes, you know, we didn't have enough food, but as communities go, we made sure that we shared our food. And, you know, schools were quite tough in those days. And when I think about those experiences, though, I have to think of them as positive, because they have made me as an adult very open and willing to change remarkably well. The best time, I think, in my community was story time, and we had a gentleman. His name was and he was my personal mentor, Elder Watson, and Elder Watson used to like to talk about the story of the Ghost Dam, and to put it in context, there's two rivers that flow by my community, and one of them is the Bow River, and the other one of them is the Ghost River. And where they converge, this is where Calgary Power in 1929 put in a dam. Originally, the lake was called Dead Man's Lake. And growing up, I was terrified of the dark, and I was, you know, terrified of ghosts and anything that even the mention of it. So when I thought about the Ghost Dam, I would get scared. But as an adult, I've really gone back, and I've looked at the history and the story of how that dam came into place. And I'm thinking of it in today's context. That wouldn't have happened. Back in the early 1900s, the Indian agent came out and he negotiated a lease for the dam with the community, and this lease was, the chief got $5, I think, and the councillors got $2, and the members in the community got $1. And we got so many brood mares. And when you're looking at here is a group of people whose land has been flooded out and relied on the Bow River and the Ghost River as a source of food, to have all this change taken and still be able to go on and grow the community and handle this change is absolutely, in my opinion, the definition of resilience. And when I hear people telling me is, you know, you've got to monitor your stress and you have to be, you know, be resilient. And when I look at communities across Canada, we've always been resilient. You know, we've been a group of people that have been taken and relocated and said, you will live here. We have bands or communities that have been torn apart, and one community placed here and another community placed there. So as a group of people, I feel strongly that we've been really resilient. The challenge for us is going to be going forward. How do we take this resilient nature and put that into positive economic development, not only for ourselves, but for our communities, when I think of the billions of dollars that wonderful lawyers like Scott are negotiating and bringing down on communities, I think of the wealth that we can create, and how we can really take our place in the marketplace. And when you look at the West Banks and the Osoyoos, it is possible. And so, you know, I think it's really relevant to have this discussion about, you know, as Indigenous people, how are we going to take this action and go forward and really become this economic force within Canada. Thank you, Jeff.
Sorry. Thank you, Georgina. Scott, your comments?
Yes, thank you very much.
Scott, you're muted.
You're muted, Scott.
I just want to say thank you very much for the invitation to attend today. Georgina, thank you for that. Jeff, thank you for the kind introduction. I just want to acknowledge today where I'm gathered is on Algonquin territory. So I'd just like to acknowledge the Algonquins for allowing us to gather on their territory and walking softly and carrying their laws with us today. I guess introduction remarks, I just wanted to touch upon, there were basically 4 stages that were laid out in the webinar invitation. And that dealt with disruption, entanglement, emergence, and empowerment. And I can see the full spectrum in terms of what Georgina was talking about in terms of where we've come from, the disruption and the entanglement. And I just wanted to speak about that because I think it's important to ground our discussion today in some of the historical context. And the reason why I do that is because I often have to endure conversations where much is discussed in terms of the misconceptions and stereotypes of Indigenous people. And you have to unpack a lot of what you look at today in terms of, well, why are First Nations, you often hear as, how are we going to fix the First Nations problem? You know, I'm always taken back by that. Like, why is it a problem? It certainly isn't the First Nations problem. It's been a problem that's been generated by the colonial governments, which have, you know, controlled First Nations since at least the early 1800s. And so I think it's important to look back at the original relationship with First Nations people in Canada. If you go back to the 1600s when the Europeans first arrived, there was very much a mutual relationship of dependency, much more so for the Europeans at that point. Keeping in mind they'd never been here, they didn't know how to survive long, hard winters. So they basically relied on First Nations people to establish economies here in North America. And established economies they did, and they did it jointly. And so it always amazes me when we see what's happening out in Nova Scotia right now. We're talking about treaty rights, and people have a hard time, and somehow along the way, rights for Indigenous people have been limited to a moderate livelihood. And to me, from a legal perspective, that just does not make any sense, because First Nations people living in this land never experienced a moderate livelihood. They had a full livelihood, a full economy. They had a robust trading program set up across North America, and there's all kinds of archaeological evidence to support that. And the Europeans benefited from that, and they used that to their advantage. And then somewhere along the way, those relationships became severed and dependencies started to change. And so you see the enactment of the Indian Act, which was full of statutes and laws that purposefully removed First Nations from the economy. And you see that, you know, throughout the act, where there were specific provisions which prohibited First Nations from selling produce that they grew on the First Nation reserve. It was illegal for them to sell the produce off the reserve, and you have to ask yourself, why would you enact such a statute? You know, there still is provisions within the Indian Act that prohibit First Nations from mortgaging their own properties. Which, how do you enter into an economic sphere and develop any kind of capital base if you can't mortgage the very property that you own? Supply management schemes. I have done a lot of work and research recently into the supply management with respect to milk boards and egg boards and chicken boards and whatnot. And there was a purposeful exclusion of First Nations when they were setting up these programs back in the 50s, 60s. And so, again, another huge market kind of exploitation, which was completely denied to First Nations. And so again, you see these kind of market developing all through North America with the purposeful exclusion of First Nations. So I think that's important to know too. And then you see crazy laws along the way where First Nations were actually prohibited from hiring lawyers to represent their claims. So what that entails is, in terms of the historical context of where we are in 2020, you have to realize that the economy has been purposely suppressed on First Nations for First Nations people. So the rest of North America got a huge head start, right? And so we're scrambling as collective communities to catch up, right? And in the meantime, much harm has been done to First Nation communities. So not only were we excluded from economies, and so you see the development of underground economies where you see First Nations involved in cigarettes, and during the Prohibition, they were very much actively involved in that. You now see development of cannabis operations, which would be considered to be underground in some situations. The general mainstream has forced First Nations into these economies, where they have survived. And obviously the title of our presentation today is Resiliency. So there is a certain amount of resiliency built into First Nations. But luckily, through the efforts of people like Georgina and Jeff, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. And so this misconception of First Nations not being able to or have the capacity to deal in these economies, I think is an extreme falsehood. And I think what we need to now work on is eliminating these stereotypes, leveling the playing field, which still is remarkably slanted against First Nations. And we'll talk about a little bit of that in some of the questionings that we're going to go through. But I just wanted to provide that historical context to give a base and a grounding of where we are and where we've started. And when you hear stories like Georgina's community and growing up in that community without running water, it's a story that's shared amongst many Indigenous entrepreneurs across Canada. Very humble beginnings. And so that may be a detriment in some people's eyes, but the fact that you can survive and you can still feel a part of an economy, even coming through those hardships, and I think that definitely points to the resiliency of Indigenous people in Canada. And so very happy to be a part of this conversation, and very much look forward to the conversation and the discussion.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for those words. I have 3 questions here. I'm going to ask them one at a time and give each of you a chance to answer and give us your thoughts on this. And Scott, I think I will start with you, if you don't mind. And the question is, what do you see as the biggest challenge when it comes to First Nations being successful in their economic development endeavors? Is it experience? Some of the factors might be experience, staffing, finance, opportunity, location. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think, thanks, Jeff, great question. So I think what I see is the biggest challenge, and there's lots of reports about this, from the Harvard Project to all kinds of government initiatives that have been started and specifically focus on finance. Access to capital is the largest, most important impediment for First Nations in terms of developing economies. And because without capital, all of those other things that you had talked about in terms of staffing and opportunities and location don't matter. And one of the biggest hurdles with respect to accessing to capital is structures that we just talked about in terms of that were created under the Indian Act, which prevent First Nations from specifically mortgaging or putting liens against certain property within the communities that they live in. And so there are some creative ways to get around that. And luckily there are people like, again, Jeff and Georgina who work in this field specifically, but they're limited in the number of communities they can reach out to. There's not a lot of Jeffs and Georginas around that specifically deal with First Nation communities and the specific problems associated. And again, I say use the word problems, not their problem, but a problem that's been created for them. And so there's a certain amount of expertise that's required when dealing with business structures and business opportunities in a community, which the communities themselves are now developing capacity and the wherewithal to be able to deal with those. But from a professional level, in terms of lawyers, accountants, financing people, it's a very specialized area, and there's not a lot of it. Luckily, you do see growth in this area. So you do see more financing options available to First Nations. that are able to avail themselves of that. And with financing, obviously, will come business opportunities. And I think it's important to realize, I mean, I don't want to leave the conversation today feeling like all First Nations are not doing well. There are all kinds of opportunities you read about. There's an equitable play going on in the oil field right now, where a collection of First Nations are bidding on or purchasing an equitable stake in a railroad that's going up to Alaska, in pipeline projects. So this equitable stake is now on the table, and lots of First Nations across Canada are looking at those options and putting themselves into that realm of investment and opportunity. So, but I still believe for the majority of First Nations in Canada, Métis communities, Inuit communities, I do believe that the number one hurdle is access to capital.
Thanks, Scott. Some good thoughts and ideas there. Georgina, same question?
For me, I look at it a little bit different. Like, first of all, Scott, I don't know anything about credit. That's why I have Tim now. He's our credit person in the trust department. But for me, is working with 80 communities across Canada, the biggest challenge is the type of governance that we're still under. And I understand every political leader has a short term. Thank goodness Trump only has 4 years. But there's a lot of our communities that they're voted in and they do not have their own election code. So I'm now suddenly the chief and I have 2 years to do something. And it's actually almost a perfect time that I've been asked to speak or volunteer to speak on this topic. Is I had a chief call me and he said, Georgina, he says, I've been reelected. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. And I said, congratulations, chief. You're great to work with. I'm looking forward to continuing our long relationship. And he said to me, but I was voted in on condition that I get some economic development projects going. And I said, oh, that's great. You know, what type of projects, what type of research have you done? He goes, well, I don't know. I thought you could tell me something. And that's kind of sometimes the challenge, in my opinion, is consultants are coming out, you can do this or you can do that. But maybe it's not realistic, or like Scott says, they can't access the capital. So it's a really big problem when you don't have that capital get started. We're starting to see, and that's more myself pushing this forward is to look at the trusts that are out there. There's a lot of First Nations who have $100, $200 million trust, and we're putting in lending clauses where the nations can borrow from the trust and pay themselves the interest instead of paying the bank. And this can help fund some of their economic development projects. But we're also seeing alternative investments where trusts are coming in. And recently I was involved with a nation who had an opportunity to buy an equity share in Ontario hydro line. And the trust bought it for the nation. And this is a way of generating income. But it's not really the right way, because it's also not generating jobs. But going back to the trust where the nations can borrow from the trust instead of a bank, I have some nations who have borrowed from the trust and started solar power energy projects, and they're employing people in their community, and they're gaining a great source of income from these solar projects. So I think the biggest thing for me, Scott, is people have to, and even the people they're working with, the consultants, is I really hate it when I go into a community and they've said, well, you know, they're trying to fit this square peg in this round hole. This is the way you're going to do it. And I think people need to remember that each community is unique, and that, you know, when you're consulting, do that, you know, ask them, what can you do to help? Where do you want to go? Where is your vision? You know, where is your location? You know, if I'm located, up in the middle of the Arctic with nothing but ice around me, there's not going to be a lot of tourism or economic development. So I have to look another way.
Thanks, Georgina. That's a different slant on things, but both excellent points. Second question I've got, and Scott, if you don't mind, I'll ask you first. What advantages, opportunities are there for non-Aboriginal entities to partner with First Nations?
That's a very good question that gets asked often in the circles that I travel in. And so I think a lot of those are organic in a sense of relationships, but the very first one that I would talk about would be business operations certainty. What does that mean? Well, for any business dealing, in the realm of the areas where First Nations are found, and I'll just use northern communities here as an example, but this can also apply to many of the urban communities you see on the West Coast and Western Canada. But you'll often in a project have hurdles such as environmental assessments, permitting authorizations, those kinds of things. So partnering with a First Nation in the sense of getting advanced kind of partnerships and approvals and consultation with First Nations, making them part of a project, creates that certainty, that business certainty. And so companies will often say, well, so what we'll just, if we have to, we'll fight them in court. We're going to get the permits. We're going to get what we need to do. But comes with certainty also comes with the fact that a lot of these companies are shareholder. They have shareholdings, publicly traded companies that have to bow down to public perception. And so that used to have lesser kind of influence than it does now. Because of social media and because of the way that news travels very quickly, investors become a little bit more timid when they know that projects are being opposed by local and resident First Nations and Inuit communities. So that creates this idea that, leads to some more corporate responsibility, I would say. So that's more of a stick than a carrot, but it exists. And I think it's important to understand that relationship. So when you are dealing with a big developer, whether it be hydro or a mine or something like along those lines, there is kind of a pull, right? The First Nation is pulling in the company as a partner to say, look, we want to play ball here. We want to work together. And if you don't, there's plan B, and that's going to be a rougher road for you. So I think that's an advantage for businesses in terms of just creating the relationship. But then that relationship then leads to other things in terms of employment opportunities. And so you get into some of these remote communities, and one of the largest expenses associated with some of these development projects is employment. They usually have to locate employees from very far distances. They have to house them, those type of things. And generally speaking, there are First Nation communities in very close proximity where you could save a ton of money on expenses with respect to human resources and whatnot. You also have people that are familiar with the climate, they're familiar with the environments. So there's less, changeover or loss of employment. So that's another big advantage. Access to markets is becoming increasingly an advantage for non-Indigenous companies and organizations to partner with Indigenous groups. And so you'll say, well, where are those markets? You've got lots of opportunities in the West Coast, close to large cities. You see that in Ontario, close to Toronto. There's a remarkable amount of space available, and I'll just use my own community as Six Nations of the Grand River. Massive opportunities for warehousing and all kinds of wonderful things, because you've had growth all around for decades, and then you have these untouched swaths of land that are available for whatever development the First Nation deems acceptable. So there is a very large opportunity for access to markets in that sense. There's also there's a wonderful world of First Nation set-asides that a lot of it goes unused. And what do I mean by set-asides? So government's procurement is literally in the billions of dollars on an annual basis. And through the new, the so-called improved NAFTA agreement, there are specific provisions provided in there where percentages of procurements from Canada are obligated to be set aside for First Nation organizations and companies. So that's a massive opportunity for First Nations to find themselves in exclusive bidding contracts on some of those service agreements. You also see initiatives like in Ontario, which is now no longer available, but it was for quite a few years, with respect to the Ontario feed-in tariff. So it was trying to promote renewable energy within the province, and a certain number of dollars were allocated to that. A certain number of projects were allocated, and a percentage of those projects were set aside specifically for First Nations. And firsthand, I've seen an incredible kind of growth in some of the communities that took advantage of those opportunities to bid on some of those energy producing contracts whereby they were set aside for First Nations. So you saw a scramble of non-Indigenous companies trying to partner up with First Nations to take advantage of that. So some people think it's kind of a tokenism type of opportunity, but I would disagree and say that those opportunities create real and solid and permanent economic ventures for First Nations that take advantage of some of the things that Georgina was talking about, of investing their trust funds, looking for solid opportunities to partner with blue chip companies to create lasting ventures. And so then you see this stream of revenue that is built into like a 40, 50 year wind turbine project or hydro project, which creates then further opportunities, because then it becomes an equitable piece of property that the First Nation can borrow against, that they can create further economic opportunities. So there are all these advantages to participating and partnering with First Nations. So there's a host of opportunities that I would encourage non-Indigenous companies to look for when they're looking for partners.
Good point, Scott. And just to follow up on your first one about creating business operations certainty and working with First Nations in permitting and approval. I'm a financial analyst by trade, and the buzzwords now, it's all ESG, environment, social governance. And it's been shown through many studies that companies, public companies especially, that work with First Nations rather than, going hard at them versus, working cooperatively, they're better corporate citizens. And at the end of the day, they make more money, they're better investments. So it just makes a really good business case to be cooperative versus being, like sort of hard on people and working against them. It just makes good business sense, besides making up opportunity for everybody. Now, Georgina, same question for you, advantages and opportunities.
I really think, and I agree with both of you, and Scott and I have shared a client quite a ways up north. And when you're looking at these nations that are in the ring of fire, they are setting up catering companies, they're setting up laundry services, they're doing land services. So these are opportunities that people didn't think about in the past that they are now thinking about. Is if I get into business with this proponent that's come to see us, what is that proponent going to get back besides the cash? And I think that's one of the questions I would like to bump back to Scott and put him on the spot here is when I started in this, and I've been around a really long time, Scott, proponents that came out would just say, here's some money, and here's some money for your school, and we're going to do this. And I found that's really detrimental, and I've seen a change, but is that consistent across or the board, or is that just me? I've been lucky to see the change with certain communities.
Yeah, that's thanks for putting me on the spot, Georgina. So the offer of money, right, that it really is problematic in a sense of some of the communities that find themselves in that kind of that forced relationship, I'll call it. So you do have a massive project that's being developed right beside your community, and so the corporation approaches the First Nation and deals with the First Nation how they deal with many problems. They just try to throw money at it, and by doing so, they alienate the community from the perspective of an influx of money to a community that hasn't had a lot of money in a very short amount of time can create massive amounts of problems. I mean, you can look at Hobbema or Mascosis, I guess it's called now, and communities across Canada that have dealt with this, where there's just the economy flips upside down in terms of the amount of money flowing within the community. And so, but what happens in those cases, oftentimes, not always, you see that there's not a lot of permanent kind of economic investment. It's a rush of money. The money gets spent. There's not a lot of lasting structure, and so it is dependent upon like governance structures within the community, strong kind of cultural, attachment to the community and those type of things. But you really need kind of like leadership within the community to be able to deal with that. So, I mean, I understand where companies are coming from. They want to write a check. They want to make it part of the business expense, and they want to move on. But what we just talked about is much more important in terms of creating a relationship and talking about good governance and corporate responsibility and having that more permanent kind of how do we help the community beyond just giving them money. It doesn't mean you can't, flow money into the community through all kinds of other economic avenues, such as employment, such as education, helping out with some of the things within the community, whether it be schools or elder complexes or even gymnasiums for the kids to play in, mental health access. Like there's all kinds of things that you can help a community with beyond just giving them money. Those things can come in all different kinds of forms. So, and one of the things you might have wanted to do in that situation, and I know which situation you're talking about, Georgina, is it might have been nice to ask the community, specifically, well, what is it can we help you with? You have a laundry list of things that we can help with. What are they? As opposed to just writing a check. So I'd like to think that it's changing as well. And I see a lot more opportunities with organizations and companies reaching out to First Nations and Inuit communities in terms of looking at long-term growth. Like let's not just give you some money today. Let's develop some form of equitable contribution that will last into the future and future generations. So I'd like to think that corporate responsibility is changing, but there's still a lot of bad actors out there. And so it's up to the advisors and the people that work with First Nations, the First Nations themselves, to go and look. There's lots of examples in Canada now where you can look across and say that worked for them, that didn't work for them, why not? And let's figure out best practices.
Excellent.
And if I may, Jeff, just one more question, Scott, because I really do want to talk today. I still finding it quite challenging. There's this duty to consult and accommodate, and yet there's communities that, and they're all over the press, that are blowing up because there wasn't that proper consultation. And to me, that really leads into what Terry's talking about, is resilience. If I'm going to come into your community and I'm going to put up a dam, or I'm going to, mine your community, and there's going to be that type of change, then shouldn't there be some kind of proper consultation and engagement?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, you don't have to. You're speaking to the converted on my part. I've been to the Supreme Court arguing duty to consult cases. So yeah, it's a constitutional right. The duty to consult, right? If a decision by the government in any capacity is going to potentially impact an Aboriginal or treaty right, then a First Nation has to be consulted. This government that we currently have has made a commitment to implement UNDRIP, right? And UNDRIP specifically states that it's not just consultation. You have to get consent, right? You have to get consent from the First Nation community in order to carry out these projects. So there's a whole body of case law on that. But I think a lot of that, and what I always tell the communities, or advise the communities, I guess I don't tell anybody anything. I advise the communities that I work with, you want to take on this responsibility yourself. Don't expect the law to protect you in these areas. So as soon as you smell or hear or taste of any kind of development, whether it be through a notice provision or you read the newspaper, and certainly there should be people in your community that are trained to do these type of things. When you see a water permit being asked for in certain areas of Canada, that it's going to be also followed by mass scale development. you need to know that these triggers are out there and you need to be aware of them. And as soon as those triggers start to hit, you need to start asserting, right? You need to stand up within your community and make sure that these developers and project managers and when all these, a lot of times it's a capacity issue because there's so much coming out of community in terms of, well, we need your consent on this. We need to consult you on this. There's so much happening that a lot of things kind of get lost in the shuffle or slip through the cracks. And next thing you know, you're into a development stage. So you take it upon yourself as a community to be aware of these, to know what the law is, but more importantly, to assert your rights. And one of the things you want to do within a community perspective to address that specifically is to develop a consultation protocol, right? So that regardless of what the law says, regardless of how the courts are going to protect you, you have your own consultation within the community, your own consultation protocol, so that when and if you ever have to stand before a court or a tribunal and say, you know what, they didn't even satisfy our own protocols, of which everybody knows, they're posted, and they knew what they needed to do. They didn't approach us. So forget what your consultation protocol is. They didn't adhere to our protocols. And so I think that's more powerful because, First Nations and Inuit communities are self-governing, right? They're self-determining. They can pass their own laws. They can have their own protocols. They can determine how things are supposed to operate within their traditional territories. So I would start to assert those rights and protect themselves.
That's an excellent point, Scott. And I like the whole idea of watching for the triggers and being proactive. I think that speaks volumes. Third question, Georgina, we're going to start with you this time. Give Scott a break. How do First Nations improve their business connections with non-Aboriginal companies? Working together as a group, the nations that is it better one-on-one? Do they need help from senior governments? What are your thoughts on that? How do they improve their business connections?
I think that's always a challenge. And for me, the reason that there's a challenge is there is a certain perception about the communities that a good portion of the time isn't correct. And talking about lawsuits, and since we have Scott here, is I'm still seeing lawsuits with municipalities against local communities. And if you have and I'll just use the town of Cochrane, suing Morley and not working with Morley, then really how do you encourage these other business opportunities to come in? They're going to say, well, if they're not getting along with them, why would I go in and why would I want to work with them? And I always think about Enoch Cree Nation here, which is on the border of Edmonton, and they're a very long client of mine, and they built these wonderful condo units for their elders and for people in their community to live in. But the city of Edmonton wouldn't get them water. So for me, if I was building business relationships, if someone came and I was looking for that type of business relationship and someone came and asked me the question, or would I be interested in talking? I see a lot of no, we're not interested, we're not involved with that, we're not open to it. Rather than saying no, I would actually engage in a conversation to see what opportunity there was. Because I don't want to shoot down the opportunity before I even know what it is. And in my general opinion, it is valuable for non-Indigenous business entities to work with Indigenous business entities. It's when we just look at social, good corporate social responsibility, you're seeing, a lot of corporations wanting to do that, and their first line of choice is actually the Indigenous business. And we've even seen that at Peace Hills Trust, where the government of Alberta said, well, there's an Indigenous bank here, we want to work with them first before we go out to, the mainstream banks. So I think we're going to see more and more opportunities.
Thanks, Georgina. Scott, over to you.
Yeah, so I think the key in that question is, First Nation business connections. So it harkens back to a little bit of what you and Georgina talked about before, Jeff, with respect to, I think the strongest ally in a sense of creating business connections is to look internally for the First Nations or Inuit communities, Métis communities first. And again, it goes back to creating certainty, right? And what you're talking about in certainty is how that community projects itself out. So we talked about already about clear corporate governance, bylaws, board of directors, knowing specifically who you're dealing with from the business aspect of the community. It's very important. And this is something I advise more often than not. You need a clear division between business and politics, right? From a community perspective, First Nations, when they're dealing with companies want to know who the corporation that they're dealing with is, and they want to know who the leadership of the community is. And sometimes they're the same, but oftentimes they're not. So you want a clear division, and you want to know who you're dealing with, who makes the decisions, and in what best interest. So that's extremely important. You need to develop plans, right? Business plans. So from in the community's perspective, because oftentimes this goes back to what Georgina was talking about in terms of the money that's being offered for a potential project. Communities don't have any plan. They don't have a plan as to a 5, a 10, a 20-year plan as to, we want to develop these kinds of businesses in these locations within our community, and we want to develop this kind of sector, and we want to, our people within our community develop these kind of human resources to develop and factor into that development. That's extremely important, because you need to know who you are and what you want to do, as opposed to just grabbing things as they come. You want to have more of a plan and a structure. You want to have consultations within the community to understand that the community is accepting of these type of operations and projects and whatnot, and where the community is heading. Some communities are very pro-development. If you do a poll of the community members, they're very much on board with large-scale development within the community or around the community. Other communities are much more closed. They don't want that. So you need to understand, what it is you're trying to do for each community. I think that's important. And then promoting business development within the community. Oftentimes it's this top-down approach where, somebody comes along and says, we're going to develop here and you're going to like it or not. There's very little business development within the community. And so what happens is exactly what Georgina was talking about before. You have a massive opportunity sitting right beside you, and there's no infrastructure, there's no business development to service it. So there are all kinds of opportunities: security, catering, cleaning. There's all kinds of things that people could monopolize and take advantage of, because you've got a closed system right next to you. And all those opportunities kind of go by the wayside. And so having some infrastructure and some business development and the business development model within the community is extremely helpful, right? So that's kind of the internal part. So this is what you're going to do to take care of your own house. But there's also an external. And I think one of the things that I've seen with respect to successful First Nations is you're establishing relationships with service providers. So you're talking to the Georginas of the world, the Jeffs of the world. Legal services, financing is extremely important. You need to develop these relationships, and not just calling them the minute you need something from a project. You need to develop a relationship. You need to know that you've got a 2, 3, 5-year relationship with this person on the phone who's going to go to bat for you when you do need a big ask. And you can have these people at your fingertips, and they have a wealth of experience dealing with other communities and situations and opportunities and whatnot. And the most important thing is you want to make sure that they have experience dealing with First Nations, right? If you're looking for service providers, the first question you should ask is, I want a list of 10 other communities that you've worked with, because I'm going to approach them to find out what kind of person you really are. Those are the questions that you should be asking to make sure you know what you're getting. And then finally, in terms of if you're trying to attract and build those connections, there should be protocols that we just talked about in terms of building relationships. So we talked about the consultation protocols, but there should also be dispute resolutions, right? To know what happens if things don't work out with your new business partner. How is that you don't want to find yourself embroiled in very costly and expensive and time-consuming litigation. There's got to be a better way. Lots of First Nations draw upon their own principles with respect to dispute resolution. Make sure those are known, make sure they're posted, make sure people understand how they work. And then finally, within your own organizations, there has to be a need for capacity training and funding, right? You need to fund these type of things. where you can send off people to become experts in whatever area of economic development you want to create. But there has to be some capacity that stays within the community and wants to help develop it internally. Then you have something to sell, right? Once you've got your internal and your external all set to go, you have something to actually sell. And more importantly, you'll start creating relationships with other First Nations in which you have a market. And as soon as a market's created, you're going to get lots of corporations banging on your door saying, we want to become part of this loop. You seem to have a very good, network of other communities that you deal with. We want a part of that. How do we get in? So then you create a demand and a need, which is much different than what's happening right now.
And Jeff,
Excellent.
if I may, I
Yes.
just want to build on what Scott was talking about, because when you say I'm going to get on a bandwagon, my new thing is provinces and the federal government have given communities quite a lot of money to develop community comprehensive plans, strategic plans, or capital plans. And a lot of communities have developed these plans and they've set them aside and completely forgot about them. And that is wrong. I think that these community comprehensive plans can work with the cash access or your proponent. And I'm seeing some of the plans that I've seen from the interior of BC is in their community comprehensive plan, they actually had an IBA, Impact Benefit Agreement Office, who had these protocols. If you want to talk to us, this is what you have to do, and these are the steps that you have to take. And then if you're going to engage in business with us, this is the protocol. And like accessing capitals, a lot of First Nations now have land departments. And if you have a land department, then that person needs to be trained in the land. And hopefully they're part of this Land Management Act. So it's everything he says I'm agreeing with. So I could talk to him for hours. We actually did recently. So, but I see that there's 4 questions. So can you see them, Jeff, or do you want me to call them up and ask them?
You can feel free.
Okay, the first one is from Jamie Sue, and she says, I would like the idea of a I like the idea of a consultation protocol. Where might we be able to view an example? Scott?
Yes, I've got several consultation protocols that I can share. If you want to just provide me an email or whatnot, I can send those out, or I can send them to Georgina, who can post them to the group. Anybody who's participated today, I'd be happy to share those.
That's good.
I have some too if they
Okay. Contact us.
Yep.
I can get this.
haven't talked about that, but I get struggle sometimes that we all feel we can't talk to each other. And I think one of your biggest resources is what Scott said, is talking to your neighboring communities and other communities that maybe have gone through what you've gone through. So the next one is anonymous. How important is it to have infrastructure in place, roads, broadband, buildings, remote access?
Well, I mean, I guess it's circumstantial, right? Depending on where you are. I think those are the kinds of things, right? If you're dealing with a large project in some of the remote communities, let's for say we're talking about a remote community that doesn't have those type of things, that might be something that you want to look at in terms of is that part of the plan? Is that to create infrastructure within the community? And what are the benefits, right, to having roads and sewers, and obviously running water is extremely important. So I think those are good places to start. If and if you're working with a resource developer, a lot of those things would be easy. I say easy for the developer because they're probably building a base camp or they're doing those kinds of things anyway. So to have the equipment and the expertise up there, you get a commitment from the government maybe to cover off equal amounts in terms of service provisions and whatnot. You could see like a tripartite agreement that would help with some of that. But I don't think it's imperative that you have all of that to be able to develop economic development. I think it's a nice to have, but I don't think it's necessary. I think you can start your economic development planning and putting together a plan with respect to long term without some of those, major kind of infrastructures.
Roads are really important. I think back when I was young, we used to have this dirt road kind of, and the oil companies came in and built great roads, and it wasn't a negative, it was a positive, because they actually left this legacy of great roads.
I'll get this one, Georgina, because I want to give you guys a break. I'm gonna take this one myself. What's the most important element of a business plan? The most important element of a business plan is actually doing one. As I've told nations and clients for many, many years, if you can't make a business work on paper, you will never get it to work in the real world. You have to do a business plan. And I think the most important part after that, and this goes back to Scott's comments, do your due diligence. Have your business plan put together by a professional who knows what they're doing. Most nations have, all nations have auditors. Most of these guys have people who can put together a viable business plan for you. But do the due diligence, make sure the person's done these before, they're competent in this, and a business plan is absolutely crucial. Now that's my comments. I can go now to Scott.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that, Jeff. I think I've seen a lot of harm with people that put forward unfinished, what I would call unprepared business plans, and that is way worse than providing a business plan. It's better to give nothing than to give a bad business plan. Mm-hmm. I can't agree more. And I know sometimes communities say it costs money to put together a business plan, but if you think about it, and I don't like using these kinds of analogies, but it'd be like playing a football game without a playbook. If you don't know what plays you're going to run, if you don't know what your strengths and your weaknesses are with respect to your business plan, there's no way you're going to convince a bank or any kind of financial institution to invest in it. You're going to need to know where the shortfalls are in terms of the weaknesses, because that's where you're going to prop up your capacity and your people. And without it, you're just kind of like shooting into the dark, and you've given yourself a very strong possibility of not succeeding. So yes, a business plan is key.
Good stuff. We have one more question, Georgina, and you can take the first crack at this one. We just got a couple minutes left.
We have to read the question.
In fostering entrepreneurial spirit to Indigenous youth, what would you communicate to them?
I look at the new generations coming up, and they're so tech savvy. And, if without them, I wouldn't know how to be quite honest, how to text or, it took me a long time. I thought people were talking Spacebook before I found out it was called Facebook. But I think I was counseling an Indigenous entrepreneur, especially a youth, I would say take the time to take some business classes, because if you don't understand how businesses are run, then you're going to have problems, because there's, and it also, they need to learn the different business structures. So taking a semester or, a course on, this is how you run a business, it would be, and what's needed to run a business and what's needed to access cash. And, this is how it is to work with banks, would be, something that's, it's greatly needed.
Yeah.
Scott?
Yeah, I have the, I don't know if it's an advantage, but I was a teacher before I went back to law school. So I always, whether I like it or not, I always keep an eye as to what's happening in terms of youth development. You can't grow a community, you can't grow a nation, you can't grow anything if you don't have the faith and the belief in the children that you're raising in terms of youth. So extremely important. But what I often tell or share with youth when I do speaking engagements is like, we need good people everywhere. And when I say we, the collective Indigenous community in Canada needs good people in every field: medicine, health, law, finance, everything, every accounting, every single field that you could point a finger at, we need good people. So what I say is, it doesn't matter what you pick. Pick what you like, right? Don't pick something that you think you have to have. Pick what you like, and then go and get as much knowledge and as much certification as you can. I know it's difficult sometimes to be away from your communities and whatnot, But at the same time, when you're doing that, right, be very focused and grounded in your community. Remember your support groups, remember your teachings, remember where you came from, because it's going to be extremely important for the knowledge that you've gained in whatever field. Again, it doesn't matter what you take something, but just take something and bring back that knowledge to your community and share that knowledge. And what you're doing in that situation is you're not just sharing the knowledge, but you are creating a role model for a lot of communities. I know so many communities that I've gone into, and they can all tell you, like, the very first person that got a degree, you know, like, they'll point to somebody in the band office and say, that was the first person in our community that got a university education. And I mean, just think about that for a second. Like, where else, what other communities do you walk into in Canada where they point to somebody and say, that's the first person in Calgary that got a university degree, right? And people in their communities will also say that you know, I'm the first person in my community and my family that's gone to university. Yeah. Like, those are extremely, like, when you put it into that context, that's what you're dealing with. So from a youth perspective, you know, you want to encourage any kind of field, whether it's, you know, surveying, you know, water treatment, whatever somebody, forestry, whatever somebody wants to take, fully commit to that and get them the knowledge and bring it back to the community, because there's so many areas that communities are dying for expertise and knowledge and help. So I think that's what I would, and I would also be very optimistic to Indigenous youth and talking to them and saying, look, there are so many opportunities available. You just got to get yourself enrolled. Just get into a program, stick with it, and the world will become your oyster.
Good points. I think we can turn it back to Terry now. I think we're getting near the end of the show here. Terry?
Hey, thanks very much, Jeff. I'd like to thank our presenters, Georgina Villeneuve and Scott Robertson, and all our participants for registering for today's live webinar. I'd like to highlight our National Virtual Capacity Development Workshops that's upcoming. Particularly, we have a new one-day workshop called Not-for-Profit Governance, Achieving Your Mission Through Good Governance Practices. That's scheduled for November 17th and 18th. It's a one-day workshop, but it's held over 2 days because we're in a virtual environment. And the workshop is designed to help you gain an understanding of organizational governance as it applies to nonprofits, understand the roles, responsibilities, and duties for directors, and to determine how not-for-profit boards contribute to the mission, vision, and values of their organizations. Register today for upcoming workshops at www.afoa.ca, or please visit our website for more information and to view the recordings of slides that will be added to our webinar page. If you register and attend 3 of our webinars in this series, you are entered to win a prize and will be contacted by email. Good luck, everyone, and please fill out the survey that will appear after this webinar. Thank you very much, and have a great evening or the rest of your morning. Bye now.